So this is a diagram that will continuously evolve. Basically, it's my attempt to align the scales of Aristides Quintilianus, which correspond to those mentioned by Plato in his Republic, with the Posidonia aulos on this side and the Pydna aulos on that side. These values here are those predicted by Stefan Hagel with his dedicated aulos software. And you can see that the pitch difference, the Posidonia is roughly a quarter tone above F sharp, whereas the Pydna is roughly a quarter tone below F sharp. In fact, if you take the bottom note, it's almost 50 cents. Plus 40. So there's a semitone difference, a quarter tone above F sharp or a quarter tone below F sharp. And that is as predicted by software. And it's important because that removes the human bias, which is always a problem when working with reeds and human lips, because inevitably we produce the intonation that we want, and it's unconscious. So doing it by software just removes that unconscious effort. So then what I've done is I've played around. Each of these columns corresponds to an octave plus a tone with the tunings of Archaetas, or, to put it another way, pure intervals. So if we have messy there, then the fifth above it here is a pure fifth. And I've done that by dividing an octave into 1,200, and I know that a pure fifth is 702 cents. So it's visually corresponding to to just or pure intonation. Likewise, this major third down there. So da, do, da. That is a pure major third, and here we have a pure minor third, and then. So for each of these, it's all pure fourths, major thirds, and pure fifths. And the relationship, here we'll have, if we take messy, on this side we have the Diazelgmenon tetrachord with the tone of disjunction. So this solid bar, in each case, it's the tone of disjunction there. And so above messy, we might take a tone of disjunction before we have the next tetrachord, or we might have a conjunct tetrachord. So it's probably easiest to see with this one, which I'll call the Lydian, an unmodulating system. And the unmodulating system actually includes what you might call the modulation, because you have the tone of disjunction to the Diazelgmenon, or you have the conjunct synemenon tetrachord. So this Lydian area corresponds to two of the Aristides scales, which he calls Lydian and Syntonolydian, or tense Lydian. And of course the tense Lydian has notes higher up. So these in the little white and gold circles, that's the notation that Aristides gives. And so we can see if this is messy da 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 da, and if we go to the Lydian scale, it's la la da 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 la da da la da 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 la da da la da. Returning to messy. And I think that being able to sing these scales is vital, because when you come to put the reeds in your mouth, you need to hear the sound in your head. And so the singing, I would say, is fundamental. If you can't hear these pitches in your head, you won't be able to deliver them on the aulos. So I would say that the singing and the instrumental playing really need to be intertwined in aulos education. At least that's my feeling of it. Now, do you have any questions about this diagram?
So, when you speak about modulation, is essentially passing from, for example, Lydian through, let's say, Yastian, but through what?
Okay, well, essentially, I think that the Aristides scales aren't about modulation.
Okay.
I think you would play for 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, just in one scale. So your single piece of music will sit with just these 5 notes. So if you're playing in synton or Lydian, and you're playing in a conservative, traditional way, then your piece of music doesn't go outside that scale. That's how I would interpret these 6 scales as 6 possibilities. And for the competitions, I imagine, and again this is an interpretation, I imagine that instead of using this sort of instrument, which is I would describe as equiheptatonic, and you can play all of these, I think they would have adapted instruments where notes are adjusted so that you don't have to do any embouchure manipulation to deliver one of these scales. So it makes life easier. If you're going to modulate, then you need to have some flexibility.
Yeah.
Okay? Because as soon as you switch from one scale to another, suddenly the relationship between the intervals changes.
Yeah.
And that's inevitable if you are wanting to achieve pure intonation between the pipes. So that means embouchure manipulation, like a violinist adjusting the position of the fingers on the strings. That can come. It just takes practice. So I think with these instruments, which again, it's interpretation. My provisional interpretation is that it's a polymodal instrument that, say, Sacadas of Argos would have used to modulate between 3 harmoniae in the trimeles nomos, or for the dithyramb. This sort of modulatory music. You can do that on this sort of pipe because it's equiheptatonic. Yeah, so it's you can easily shift this pipe 7 cents up, that pipe 7 cents down, and hit your pure interval. Without too much embouchure manipulation. But if you're going to deliver a Dorian piece in a competition that doesn't require modulation, and you're just going to play a 10-minute Dorian piece, then you don't want to be playing this instrument. Okay. You want to be playing a dedicated Dorian aulos. Okay. So I think that when we have the discussion of different sorts of aulos, it's important to realize that maybe these are for the professionals. They want a dedicated instrument, like the one for the kithara. Yeah. So when you're accompanying a kithara, for that category of competition, you don't want to be messing around with embouchure manipulations. You want to just hit the tuning that the kithara has. So again, you don't want an equiheptatonic instrument. This is great for modulating in the middle of a piece. Yeah. It's not so great for reliably hitting one harmonia. Okay? And here with Aristides, I would interpret this as not as a modulating system, but as 6 different harmoniae, each of which would have its own dedicated aulos.
Okay.
However, you can imitate them all on the Pidna Posidonia, and the only ones that you're missing, you don't have these notes that are off the bottom of the chart, okay? So what I imagine Pronomos of Thebes might have done is added the lower notes so that you could play these notes. And of course that's what you have on the Megara, okay? So, in fact, more. So you can add these notes that are sort of off my scale here on a later instrument, and you don't need to have the keys to do that. All you need to do is let's see how it fits. Let's take the Pidna. So this is comparing Megara and Pidna. Maybe I should compare Elgin and Megara. That might be a better comparison, because the holes are a bit more similar. So here's the low pipe. Yes, okay, so that's more like it. So on the Elgin, it's roughly comparable with the, you see thumb hole roughly in the same place. The top hole's roughly in the same place. Elgin has a hole down there. Do we have a hole? Interesting. No, we don't have a hole just there, but we've got an extra note available. Okay, now because the bores are different, and by the time we get to the 3rd century BC, the tonal system has shifted. I think we've departed from, again, this is a hypothesis, we've departed from a 7-tone system and moved to a 12-tone system. That's my current working hypothesis. So coming back to this diagram, again, there's a lot that is imaginative speculation or an attempt to explain things better. One of the things that I think it does explain better than previous models is the fact that the notation divides everything into 3. So you've got a triplet. Yeah, we talk about quarter tones, but when you look at Stefan Hagel's diagram 2, you see that if you divide it into quarter tones, you've got a semitone in the middle with a quarter tone down there, which means that you've got a bigger gap at the top. So a triplet, and then a bigger gap at the top. And that just seems to me odd. So what I've done here is really I've sort of equalized. I've equalized the intervals. Instead of making them 50 cents each, I've made them a little bit bigger than 50 cents and reduced that, so that you're dividing tonal space into what becomes 3 times 7, 21. So the octave is divided into 21 equal steps, theoretically. And as far as the instrument making is concerned, or the aulos whole boring. So to divide your octave into 21 equal dieses doesn't have any literary testimony, I think. Am I correct? Nothing. Okay. The evidence for that is, if you can call it evidence, I think you can. The evidence is twofold. It's the fact that we have triplets, and it's the fact that both the Pidna and the Posidonia seem to be pretty close to an equiheptatonic division of the octave. In other words, we don't have tones and semitones, where the tones are double the size of the semitone. It's basically 171 cent tones, or small tones, all the way. The other thing to explain in this diagram is that I have simply, I suppose, the horizontal stripes. You can see that here there's a bit more overlap. Okay, so if the maker of these instruments was trying to achieve an equiheptatonic instrument, then the overlap would be the same. Okay, I suppose it would be about that much overlap on between every note. So you can see that these two pitches are a little bit closer, and these two pitches are a little bit further apart. So the question is that accidental? Were they trying to? Was the ideal an equiheptatonic instrument, or is this intentional? In which case, we're going for a slightly bigger tone there and a slightly smaller tone there. But it's nothing like as big a difference as a semitone and a tone. Where we do have the significant difference is down here. Okay, now this is clearly a semitone down here. All right, with the Pidna, that is the amount of overlap that gives you a semitone. And just to demonstrate that, on this Pidna here, so I have the low pipe in my. Oh heavens! So these reeds. Yeah, let's have the low pipe in this hand, and I've covered the bottom holes. So what I'm playing here is in Dorian. And we have la do da de. So we have messy, da, and then da da, and you can see that the Pidna gives it very nicely. You have a semitone down there without much embouchure manipulation. And I take advantage of that in my accompaniment for the Euripides Aristides chorus. So this reed, I think, is a little bit flat. I would like to maybe get it further into the pipe so I didn't have to push it up. But certainly the semitone is there. Interestingly, less so in the Posidonia. You know, so a century earlier, the maker of the Posidonia, there's a definite change. Apart from this difference in the two pitches that I've coloured red, so that's the high pipe and that's the low pipe of the Pidna. And here we have the low pipe and the high pipe of the Posidonia. So according to Stefan's software, he predicts roughly a G sharp plus 20 and a G sharp minus 26. So there's a 40-cent difference. In other words, those two notes are not meant to be in tune with one another. They give you, as you can see here, they might give you two different notes, both of which are desirable, depending whether you're playing in Phrygian or in Dorian. So here, you would want to use the higher. If you were going, so I would use the green fingering, and then the upper red fingering, and then the blue fingering, to achieve this scale. Whereas if I was playing in Dorian or in Mixolydian, I would want to use the lower red pitch. So blue, the lower red one, and your, well, so you would have to lip that down. So that's what these horizontal bars are. Let's call it the instrument scale. So there's always a slight discrepancy between the instrument scale, which goes along like this, and the musical scales, which go up and down. So if we look at this Dorian scale, Messi sits comfortably in the middle of the brown band. That means on the embouchure, the reed is in the middle. If I go down to the blue, you can see that that's comfortably in the middle. So there should be no embouchure manipulation for that fourth. And if, again, I go up to the octave, I want no embouchure manipulation. Okay? Now, if I want to get that minor third pure, I'm going to have to lip down slightly, because it's not in the middle of the blue band. And I can see that the mesopuknon is right on the cusp. So I could get it by lipping up the pink note, or by lipping down the blue note. Whereas this pitch here, the barypuknon, I would get by slightly lipping up the pink note. So what this diagram does for me as an aulos player is it predicts how much embouchure manipulation I would need in each of the Aristides scales. I can see visually the instrument scale in the horizontal bands, and the Aristides scale with archaitas or pure tuning on the vertical bands. And I have given solid bars to the enharmonic genus, and the dotted lines show notes that only occur in the chromatic and in the diatonic genus. So the higher dotted line is chromatic, and the higher dotted line is diatonic. So if this is Messi da 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 da, I'll just show that with a reed. So da 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 is your diatonic genus. La la da 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 is your enharmonic genus, and la la da 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 da, your James Bond, is your chromatic genus. La da 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 da, and the chromatic one is the gorgeous sweet one that gives you the alternation between major thirds and minor thirds, or major sixths and minor sixths. I can totally understand why they thought of it as seductive.
So a quick question
Yes.
about this. If we're thinking about I can see where Messi overlaps in some of these groupings, these four different groupings.
Yes.
What about if you were to go between Dorian and Phrygian, say? Where would be a natural point for
So,
that to happen?
well, the typical point of modulation, the evidence we have is the pieces. So the Athenaios, it's quite interesting how it modulates. It doesn't modulate the way you might expect. And I think that composers and musicians are always going to experiment and be playful. So, what would seem obvious is to go a tone above Messi, and then you can slip over here. All right. So between neighbouring, if you look at this, there's a tetrachord here. This tetrachord there corresponds to this tetrachord here, and all I've done is on the computer in Adobe Illustrator, I've just dropped it a little bit. And that's only a few cents. So given how variable in pitch the aulos is, I'm just dropping a little bit. And you'll see over here again, I'm just dropping a little bit to get from this to that one. So if you were modulating in this direction, you would just have to lift up a little bit to shift from one unmodulating system to the next unmodulating system. And these are paired according to unmodulating systems.
Right.
Yep. So that in fact, although it looks like two Aristides scales, in fact you've just got one key. You've got one key with two different areas. So, for example, if I were to sing, let's go over here to Dorian.
Okay.
Da dum ba da dee da dum ba da dum ba la dum dum da dum ba da 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 dum da dum dum ba da dum ba. Okay, da da da. The blue note there. La da. There's messy. Now, so when we go to Epinecetai, towards the end of the first section of the Athenaios, so la 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 la. So da da la. No, da 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 da. So la da 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 da, and then we switch back to this tetrachord. So la, we switch over to, if we're interpreting here as Dorian and Mixolydian, but you might interpret it here as Phrygian and Hyperlydian. But if we're in Dorian, then we're switching over to. See, I wouldn't even call it Mixolydian. It is the Synamenon root in Dorian.
Dorian,
exactly.
Right, the Synamenon root in Dorian.
Which is why it's called the unmodulating system.
Right.
And that's why I produced the other diagram, the diagram that instead of having both of those repeated, I just put it in the middle.
Right.
And I think it's easier to see one tetrachord at the bottom and then two roots above, because it makes it clearer. Okay, this is an unmodulating system.
Right.
I haven't done that in this diagram because I wanted to represent the Aristides scales.
Yes, but putting the two together.
But just so that's la la da 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 Benicetai. That's the note that's different. So that's the Synamenon note that only occurs once in that first section, and then it goes back to dum dum bum da 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 la ba da da dum dum ba dum ba. And so that's how the modulation works, mostly in Diatzelmenon, but a little touch of Synamenon to give it a bit of dynamic, a bit of tonal dynamism. Right. I put it that way. So it's not just one mode. It's like in C major, to define C major, you need to have a bit of G major. So you might have a D7 chord going to G major, so you're sitting on that dominant chord and you feel like you're in that dominant, and then it returns to the tonic. So that's sort of what's happening, a comparison that one could make tonally. Contrast. It's nice to have contrast. It's nice to have a place you go to, and then you can come back. So you stay in the Diatzelmenon area, you visit the Synamenon, and then you come back to Diatzelmenon.
And the choice of where to do that in the Athenaios Pine is in one of the most marked places in the piece. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Apollo's arrival.
Yeah. So this layout it shows how you could modulate on the Pidna. Mm-hmm. The Aristides scales and the Pidna, that's roughly the same sort of date. Mm-hmm. And so, but I'm not sure. Maybe I think of the Pidna as a dithyrambic instrument, or it's certainly loud with these sorts of reeds. Nice big 13 mil cane. It makes sense. It can produce a fantastically large sound. And so I think of dithyram, and if you're going to be playing dithyram, then certainly by the end of the 6th century they were modulating, doing all sorts of interesting experiments. So that's my feeling, that we have an equiheptatonic instrument that Sacadas of Argos would have been able to modulate through. He would have been able to accompany a choir modulating successive strophes from Dorian, upper tone to Phrygian, upper tone to Lydian. So you see, I've put Lydian Messe there, okay? But actually, it's you just move so up one tone to the Phrygian area, and then we'll skip the Iastian. We'll modulate up a tone to this Messe here, which is what Aristides calls Syntono-Lydian, but all the others call Lydian. Okay, it's interesting that Aristides calls this Lydian, which Aristoxenus would call Hypo-Lydian, but maybe one could align with Aeolian if one is stretching, being imaginative, and going back to the early 6th century, of which we have very little evidence indeed.
Right.
Here we can also get him downwards. Here.
Yes, and in fact, that might make more sense because Dorian is the middle ground. Mm-hmm. So you could say that Phrygian is sort of going up a tone, and then you could go down a tone to, and maybe that's where there's evidence for calling it Aeolian. Okay, the idea that Aeolian is a tone lower than Dorian. And what works rather well there is then having Iastian a tone lower. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you go from Iastian, upper tone to Aeolian, upper tone to Dorian, and that sort of solves. It's a possible solution to what appears to be an inconsistency in the sources regarding the triad of 3 harmoniae and the names that they're given by different people, and it's tempting to tidy it all up. Maybe it was always a bit messy.